Singapore's total population falls for the second straight year, mainly due to a decrease in the number of work permit holders. The Ministry of Education announces more detailed rules on what PSLE candidates need to do if they are under quarantine. And this award-winning video throws the spotlight on how young Singaporeans feel about the impact of climate change. You're watching The Big Story. I'm Haryanto Diman. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode. Singapore's total population has fallen for the second consecutive year, mainly due to a decrease in work permit holders. According to the government's annual population in brief report, the total population was 5.45 million in June. That is a 4.1% reduction from last year, with the number of citizens, permanent residents and non-residents all showing declines. The figures for marriages and parenthood also fell in 2020 compared with 2019. There were 12.3% fewer marriages, in part due to measures introduced during the circuit breaker, as well as 2.8% fewer births among citizens. Here to discuss the data is Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the School of Business at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Welcome to the show, Professor. Our population and birth rate numbers have been declining even before the pandemic. Professor, do you see this steeper drop as one-off owed to COVID-19? And do you think the figures will revert to their usual trajectory post-pandemic?
Well, first, let's break down the drivers of our resident population growth. That's going to be immigration, births, and deaths. If you look at births and deaths, the long-term decline in our population growth rate, that's largely determined by our stagnant total fertility rate. Once you combine that with our aging population, that's actually the main reason why our population doesn't grow much over time. As for immigration, that's really the only policy lever that we have to control the overall population number. You know, we've been trying a lot over the years to boost total fertility rates, but in reality, our effects, our policies have had actually very little effect on moving the numbers there. So the big policy lever really is just your immigration rate. Now, when you look at this year's fall in the resident population, that's actually caused by COVID-19. Now, that's not because people are dying, fortunately. It is actually because more residents have been away from Singapore for at least 1 year. And that's because the population figure is based on whether somebody is ordinarily resident in Singapore, meaning present within the last 12 months. So for those Singaporeans who are working or living abroad, a lot of them weren't able to return at all during the last year, so they don't get counted. And of course, if somebody has a stable job overseas and you look at the economic fallout from COVID-19, they may also decide it's not a good time for them to return home either. So all of these things combined, that means that the rate of return of Singaporeans abroad in the last year has been very low. And that accounts basically for the population decline due to COVID-19.
Professor, it's the first time there's been a year-on-year decrease in both the citizen and resident populations since the data were first collected in 1970. Now, if this continues, what are the serious repercussions for Singapore?
Well, again, this year's decrease, it's likely caused by the fact that Singaporeans and PRs abroad just haven't been able to return to Singapore over the last year. Now, technically, if you're abroad permanently, if you're working or studying there, and you have reported that as such, you've changed your address officially to an overseas address, you are not counted in the local population. But I think a lot of people don't report that an overseas address, and so they drop out of our resident population at any point if they are not showing up in Singapore for at least 1 year. So I don't expect that this pattern of people not returning to Singapore will persist once travel starts reopening. What we would be concerned about is if our population starts to decline in the longer term because Singaporeans are moving permanently overseas to look for better opportunities. And that would affect the quality of our labor force, especially because we can expect that the ones who would leave Singapore to look for things elsewhere would be the most qualified, the most high-skilled Singaporeans. And, we've had worries about this kind of brain drain many decades ago. We haven't worried about it recently because Singapore today is such an attractive place to work. But we have to be mindful that we need to deliver a good economic recovery from COVID-19. Otherwise, highly qualified Singaporeans may well find better opportunities abroad, and that would actually harm the quality of our labor force.
Professor, thank you so much for your perspectives and for your time today. That was Associate Professor of Economics Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences. The Education Ministry said today that quarantined pupils who wish to take the PSLE this year must inform the school by noon on the day they receive a quarantine order. They'll also need to take a daily antigen rapid test at 6 p.m. on the day before each paper. These more detailed rules follow an earlier announcement on Sunday that those on quarantine have to be PCR negative at the start of the QO and test negative on ART at home within 24 hours before each exam paper. These are the new rules. Quarantined pupils must wait at home for authorities to administer their entry PCR test. If they test negative on that and later on the ART, they must photograph the negative ART result. On the day of the paper, they must show the negative PCR test and ART result photo in order to sit the exam. And they have to take an ART on the day before each of their other papers. Sports Singapore announcing today that sports programs for children and seniors have been suspended. All programs for children 12 years and below will be stopped until October 10th and October 24th for programs for seniors. Now, if you are using dual-use scheme or DUS facilities, take note that only 2 people are allowed on each badminton court at DUS indoor sports halls, and that cap includes a coach. For team sports like netball, volleyball, basketball and floorball, only 2 people, again including a coach, are allowed per half court. For DUS school fields, up to 50 are allowed at any one time, but they can only be in pairs. For all DUS facilities, participants must maintain 2 meters between individuals and 3 meters between pairs, and they must be fully vaccinated before booking the facilities. According to local media, Malaysia is considering reopening its borders amid expectations that it will lift a ban on interstate travel next month. National Recovery Council Chairman and ex-Premier Muhyiddin Yassin said ministers will discuss this week whether to allow fully vaccinated Malaysians to travel abroad, as well as to let tourists and business travellers into the country. He added that the matter would be brought to the Prime Minister and an announcement would be made soon. As said yesterday, 84.4% of Malaysia's adults have been fully vaccinated. Meanwhile, the US is urging that anyone unvaccinated should avoid non-essential trips to Singapore and Hong Kong, citing a quote high level of COVID-19. To that end, the Centres for Disease Control and Prevention has raised its travel advice for Singapore to level 3, one below its highest level. In non-COVID-19 news, a woman accused of giving a sexual bribe to an ICA officer has had her charges abated following her death last month. Chinese national Cheng Wen-chuan was accused of 18 counts of graft and 2 offences under the Women's Charter. She died on August 27th and the Attorney General's chambers didn't disclose details about her death. Cheng made the headlines last year after she allegedly gave an ICA officer a free massage with a sexual act. In exchange, she would arrange for her to be issued with a special pass to remain in Singapore. Disgraced bookseller Kenny Leck has confirmed he will step back 100% from indie bookstore Books Actually, giving up the directorship and 100% of the shares of the store to 5 employees who have not been named. Mr. Leck owns 50% of the shares, and he'd been in the process of buying back the remaining shares before Saturday's expose by Rise Media about his alleged misconduct towards young female staff members. The US has condemned North Korea's latest missile test, which it says poses a threat to its neighbors and the international community. The launch came just before North Korea's ambassador to the United Nations said that no one could deny his country's right to self-defense and to test weapons. R&B singer R. Kelly faces the possibility of life in prison after being found guilty of sex trafficking and racketeering. Prosecutors said Kelly was a serial sexual predator who abused young women, girls and boys for over 20 years. Best known for the 1996 hit I Believe I Can Fly, Kelly pleaded not guilty to the charges. We're marking World News Day today together with nearly 500 news organizations around the world. Global warming, climate change, the story of our generation, and 2021 is being declared the hottest year on record. This year's campaign highlights the critical importance of journalism in providing trustworthy information about the planet's future. With more is World Editors Forum President Warren Fernandez, who's also editor of the Straits Times.
I'm here in the Straits Times newsroom in Singapore, which is unusually quiet and deserted because of COVID-19 restrictions that we all know about. Now, the scientists were quick to develop a solution, effective vaccines, yet our response has been slow, hampered by populist politics, global inequalities, and a pandemic of misinformation. This has allowed the virus to spread further, mutate, and compound our problems with new waves of infection. The past months have made plain how difficult it's going to be to tackle that other looming crisis, climate change. The science is clear and getting more so by the day. The extreme weather events we have been witnessing all around the planet are signs of what could lie ahead. Yet here too, politics, inequality, and misinformation make it much harder to forge a consensus on the way forward. And this is where professional newsrooms have a vital role to play by establishing the facts and presenting the arguments and communicating these to our audiences in a clear, credible, and compelling way. Which is why we are focusing on climate change for this year's World News Day. Global warming is the story of our generation. We will showcase the work of newsrooms all around the world, telling the stories of how climate change is already impacting our communities and how these communities are responding to this critical challenge of our times.
I'm happy to have my colleagues with me now, David Fogarty, the Straits Times' climate change editor, and Audrey Tan, science and environment correspondent. Welcome to the show, guys. Battling climate change is an enormous undertaking. Now, my head just hurts thinking about it. Audrey, what is the biggest challenge of our generation in tackling climate change and climate action as well?
Yeah, Haryanto, I can empathize with you completely because it's a topic that keeps me awake at night as well. But I guess there are two key challenges that I personally see. The first is that there's not enough political will to tackle these issues. I mean, right now we are seeing a lot of net zero emissions pledges made by governments and companies, but there's really a lack of clarity about how people are going to get there. So it sounds nice on paper, but if you're not really sure how to achieve it, it really puts us all in a bind. So that's one. And secondly, I guess, from my interviews and speaking with people, I feel like there's not really a lot of motivation to kind of rethink our future. Instead, there's a lot of focus on how we can maintain the status quo, how we can continue living the lives that we lead or that we want to lead. But as the climate crisis has shown, status quo is not going to be the answer. I mean, status quo is what got us to the situation where we are now. So we really need to reimagine what does it mean to live a middle-class lifestyle, what does it mean to live in a carbon-free or in a world with less carbon emissions. So I think these are two challenges, obstacles in tackling the planetary emergency we're seeing now.
Right. And this is a critical topic to report, right? Already countless articles have been published about the irreversible damage the world is facing. But in your roles as environment reporters, how do you make climate journalism interesting and engaging? Because you said, right, earlier on as well, those challenges. So David, your thoughts on that?
So it is a challenge, but it's a critical challenge for how we tell that story. The temptation is just to put out doom and gloom headlines. And certainly the headlines this year with severe climate impacts, disasters in Germany, China, certainly the fires and heat waves in Western North America. These have been terrible. They're certainly not unique to this year. These impacts have been growing. But beyond the headlines, we really have to look at the story of how it impacts people personally, people's daily lives. So, for example, a good example is food. Now, Singapore imports a lot of its food, but where does it come from? It comes from many different countries. Some of those countries suffer impacts from floods, fires, droughts. That affects the food sources that we get here. How can you fix that? So that leads on to another critical area of solutions and technology. Now, just relying on technology to keep us in our comfortable lifestyles, as Audrey is pointing out, is not really the way we should be thinking. But one critical element or the story of climate change is how we are going to have to change our world. Climate change is societal change. That's what it's really all about. So that means changing the way we generate electricity, and that's happening. We've got different types of renewable energy. It's becoming better. It's more efficient. It means changing our transport, so going from black to green, basically. From petrol powered to electrified transport. It means making our buildings much more efficient. It means changing our finance industry. So it's not just doing the same old thing, business as usual, funding inefficient, polluting companies, supply chains. It's reimagining how all aspects of our society need to change.
Audrey, you follow very closely this topic. It is something that, and even in our own personal chats, I can tell you are very, very passionate about this topic. Throughout this whole time that you've been reporting on climate change and on the climate crisis, has reporting changed for this topic? And if so, how has it changed over the years?
Yeah, for sure. I've been reporting on this topic for about 8 years now, and David, you probably have much more experience than I do. But there's really been a lot of changes in the way climate change has been reported. I think in the past, there's a lot of focus on, okay, look, this is the problem. Why do we need to deal with this problem? But right now, we don't have to explain the why anymore. Just look at the recent spate of extreme weather events playing out around the world. This is evidence, really. We need to move beyond just telling people why they should take urgent action. So I guess, as David said, there's a lot of movement towards solutions journalism now. Instead of just telling people about the problem, you need to tell people how we can overcome this challenge together. That's one. And even here at ST, we are trying different ways of telling that story. Both of us, we really like telling climate science stories, right? We are both big climate science nerds. But beyond that, there's also the human interest stories, putting the faces of people affected by climate change to putting the human stories right at the forefront. And lastly would be harnessing multimedia. So working with our colleagues like yourself and from the video team, from the photo desk and from art desk, we're also trying podcasts. So do tune in to our Green Pulse podcast. And right now, David and I are working on a series of climate change comics. The first will be out next Monday, so do check it out.
Oh, that's going to be exciting. Now, just to round out our discussion today, David, any final thoughts?
So, the reason why climate journalism has to change is because, as I said before, it's affecting all aspects of our lives. And that therefore means that any journalist is going to find at some point a climate change sort of influence. And I'll give you a great example, the Tokyo Olympics. There was a period of extreme heat. It was affecting the spectators and the athletes to the point where it then got the conversation going about how extreme weather is affecting big sporting events. So the summer tennis in Melbourne, for example, where heat has been a problem. That's going to affect how sporting events are held in the future. When, at what time of the year do they have to shift? How do athletes adjust to the heat? So basically, in a newsroom, all journalists will have to be climate and environment journalists at some point, because you can't. The whole narrative of climate change has just shifted over time from extreme impact events and headlines to how it affects basically everything that people report on.
And these are real-life manifestations of the impact of climate change that we see in our day-to-day living. Well, thank you so much, Audrey, David, for coming on to the show to share more on climate journalism on this World News Day. I've been speaking with our climate change editor, David Fogarty, and science and environment correspondent, Audrey Tan. We want to also put the spotlight on a video that tied for first place in a competition titled #NextGen Video Challenge, telling the climate story. As part of his short documentary on Singapore's mangroves, ITE student David Lee spent 9 hours in Sungai Buloh waiting for a single shot of a crocodile crawling on land. Have a look and see if you can spot the croc he tried so hard to capture.
Singapore has a few patches of untouched nature left, each contributing to life and ecosystem balance. There is a specific part of the natural ecosystem that protects the world and Singapore from global warming and tsunamis. This is the mangroves. The mangroves are diverse trees that grow only on the tidal coast. Mangroves have not only survived the dehydrating effects of salt, but have also thrived and spread their roots. Mangrove roots grow and stay tangled in the mud, and the leaves capture and transfer the carbon to the roots. The roots then trap the carbon-rich material in the waterlogged soil, sealing it off from the atmosphere. Mangroves store 6 to 8 times more carbon than the soil of a tropical forest. This helps mitigate climate change. Mangroves are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Many species of animals thrive here, and each plays their role as part of the ecosystem. Mangroves have been threatened by deforestation for decades. Each time a hectare of mangrove habitat is removed, the carbon that is stored is released into the atmosphere, which affects biodiversity. This, in turn, affects the delicate balance between nature and life. Although Singapore has lost mangrove habitat to coastal development in the past, it is now actively preserving remaining habitat and is seeking to restore mangroves wherever possible. As a result, more mangroves are being planted in the coastal regions, and many trees are being planted in other forests. We all need to do our part to preserve the environment by protecting our biodiversity and allowing our wonderful natural coastal protectors to safeguard the wild side of Singapore.
Such a well-made video. Well, congratulations, David. You can watch his full video on YouTube. That's also where you'll find a web show for this year's World News Day. If you're watching us on YouTube, the links are in the description below. For more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com. I'm Haryanto Diman. Thanks for watching The Big Story.